Thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to the last in the series of online slavery tours with Laurence Westgaph. Laurence is taking us on a virtual guided tour of Liverpool and will be showing us the places and the spaces in Liverpool that have connections to the slave trade that have become overlooked with time. This is part of our Black History Month program, and there are still lots of other talks and events that are happening throughout October and beyond, so do keep an eye on our website. And just to let you know that we're recording this talk and that there will also be time at the end for questions, and you can add your questions into the chat box on the side. So Laurence, if you're ready, do you want to get started?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's tour. Sadly, we're having to do it virtually because of COVID, but at least we're not out in the cold and wet weather. So thank you and welcome. I'm now going to share my screen, so just bear with me and we'll get on our way. Right, before we start talking about Liverpool and the slave trade, we have to understand something about how Liverpool grew during the period that it became an important port. So Liverpool was first founded in 1207 when the charter was given by King John, but Liverpool remained a tiny little insignificant place right up until the 17th century, really into the late 17th century, actually. In fact, a book that was written in 2007 to commemorate Liverpool's 800th anniversary, Liverpool 800. The chapter that deals with Liverpool's long history from 1207 right up until 1680 is entitled Small Beginnings. So that gives you some type of example of just how insignificant really Liverpool really was up until that period. So in 1650, Liverpool's population is only about 1,250 people. That makes it about the 12th largest conurbation in the Northwest. Not in the country, just in the Northwest. Places like Preston, Lancaster, Wigan, Warrington, and Chester were all much larger population centres than Liverpool. Liverpool's great growth begins at the end of the 17th century. In fact, right at the very end, 1699 is the year that Liverpool becomes a distinct parish. Before that time, Liverpool was not even a parish. We were part of the parish of Walton. If you wanted to worship at the Mother Church of Liverpool, you had to go all the way out to Walton. If you know that part of town, if you know the flyover, the Queen's Drive flyover, there's a church at the bottom there called St Mary's. That was the Mother Church of Liverpool. All we had in Liverpool was the Chapel of Ease. It's now known as St Nicholas's Church, and I'll tell you more about that later on. But even between 1650 and 1700, Liverpool's population had increased threefold. As you can see there, the population was between 4,000 to 5,000 people by 1700. Still a tiny place, but now a parish. 1655, an event took place nowhere near Liverpool that really started to see Liverpool's growth begin. And that was with the capturing of Jamaica. And it wasn't long after that that Liverpool first engages in the West Indian trade. Now, the West Indian trade was not the slave trade directly. That was a trading in slave-produced goods, sugar, tobacco, cotton, etc. Liverpool really doesn't get into the slave trade until the last decade of the 17th century. In 1698, the Royal African Company loses its monopoly of trade with West Africa in the slave trade, and from that period on, the Liverpool merchants get in there and start trading in enslaved people. But even before then, Liverpool merchants had been involved in the illegal trade. There's records of Liverpool slave ships from 1694, 4 years before the Royal African Company loses its monopoly. But even then, in the first years, Liverpool is not a major player. It's still basically London and Bristol, who are the two main cities who are engaging in the slave trade. It's really between 1700 and 1800, though, that we see Liverpool's first great growth. And it was a massive growth. So as I said, in 1650, 12th largest conurbation. By 1800, 150 years later, Liverpool has gone from this tiny little place to the second largest conurbation in the country. Only London had a larger population than Liverpool in 1800. And much of that growth had come off the back of trade. Obviously, those types of figures, that type of exponential population growth could not have been achieved through natural increase. It had to have been achieved by people coming here from other places. And when I say other places, I don't just mean the hinterland of Lancashire or even Cheshire, or even England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. By 1800, Liverpool was already the world in one city, if you'd want to call it that. It was a very multicultural place. There were people here from West Africa and the Americas by that time. So this is a period of great growth for Liverpool, and the people who come here in order to make this great growth happen come from lots of different places. Between 1800 and 1900, Liverpool's population sees another massive increase, almost 10 times again, almost 1,000% again during the 19th century. And this is really to do with the great growth of empire. I mean, Liverpool really is the quintessential city of empire, and that is based certainly in the 18th century on the trade in enslaved people. So I mentioned the book that was written in 2007 for Liverpool's 800th anniversary. This is a quote that was written in 1907, a book written for Liverpool's 700th anniversary. And in that book, Professor Ramsay Muir, who's the head of history at the University of Liverpool, he writes, "Beyond a doubt, it was the slave trade which raised Liverpool from a struggling port to be one of the richest and most prosperous trading centres of the world." I would probably go a little bit further and say the slave economy, because many historians have kind of taken exception to this quote and have done their best to try and demonstrate that that wasn't actually the case. One of the most incredible for me is a book written by, well, it's an edited volume. It's edited by John Belchin, but the article that really stuck out for me was written by the late Michael Power. This book was only published in 1992. And in there, Michael Power says, "The slave trade is notoriously associated with Liverpool, but recent work has modified our perception of its importance and profitability. By the 1740s, Liverpool had overtaken Bristol and London as the nation's most important slave trade port. But in the context of the town's overall trade, slaves were only one element in a complex trading pattern. As significant were tobacco and sugar," and he goes on to mention cotton as well. Now, we mentioned these without a hint of irony because obviously, you know, who do you think was picking the tobacco, chopping the cane for the sugar, and picking the cotton? Yes, it was enslaved people. The slave trade was just one part of a much wider trade. It was ultimately because there was a great demand for the goods that enslaved people produced. As terrible as it sounds, the slaves were just the machinery that allowed this system to work. So to kind of try and obscure the importance of slavery to Liverpool's development by comparing it with the goods that enslaved people actually produced just seems an absolute oxymoron. Now, the importance of slavery has been remembered in Liverpool's public realm in many ways, most of which, just like historians have attempted to do either intentionally or unintentionally, have become obscured. Now, this is one of the places that we wouldn't have been able to go onto the walk today because it's so far away, but as we're doing it virtual, I thought I'd bring it in here. So we have these two fantastic palm houses in Liverpool, one in Stanley Park and one in Sefton Park, both the gifts of a man called Henry Yates Thompson. He was an antiquarian and a great philanthropist for Liverpool in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as well as gifting this beautiful glass house, he also gifted the statuary around it. So you can see these statues here. There's a number of different statues of important figures in history. And one of them is of Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus, not an important figure in the history of Britain, very important figure in the history of the Americas, whether you consider that to be a positive figure, which most people, I would think, listening to this lecture would not agree with. But nevertheless, he's an important figure, and he's also obviously an important figure in the history of Spain, but not so much in the history of Britain. When he was going around sailing the ocean blue, obviously Britain was a second-rate European power in the 15th century. And obviously his great discoveries helped to make Spain even more powerful during the 16th century. But anyway, Liverpool has a statue to him because although he's not an important figure in the history of Britain, he's a very important figure in the history of Liverpool, certainly in the eyes of Henry Yates Thompson, who coined the inscription on the statue. So here's the statue. Again, people from the south of Liverpool will know it well. And if you just look on the plinth, you'll see that there is an inscription, and the inscription says, "The discoverer of America was the maker of Liverpool." Now, I'd go one step further. I'd say it was trade with America and West Africa that really made Liverpool, certainly during the 18th and 19th centuries. America obviously was the place where the enslaved people were taken to, but it wasn't necessarily, certainly in the earliest generations, it wasn't the place that they were born, and it was very much trade with Africa, you know, in terms of enslaved people during the 18th century that helped to make this all possible, certainly for Liverpool. Now, during the 19th century, Africa would remain important even after the abolition of slavery. It was very much West African palm oil that lubricated the machinery of the Industrial Revolution and also made Liverpool an important place in soap making. Again, you think of Lord Lever over on the Wirral. It was Liverpool slave trading merchants who, after the slave trade was abolished, then got into buying and selling what was called legitimate goods, who pioneered the importation of West African palm oil into Liverpool. And again, that would be quite revolutionary for Liverpool during the 19th century. In fact, probably more money was made through the importation of palm oil than had been made in the previous century, importing the 1.5 million people that were transported on Liverpool ships during the slave trade. Now, our first stop after giving you that introduction is across the road from the Open Eye, and it's Goree. Now, Goree must be one of the most uniquely named streets in the country. I can't believe that there's another street in this country called Goree, but we have one here in Liverpool. Goree is named after an island off the west coast of Senegal, where Liverpool ships went to pick up enslaved people. Now, throughout its history as a slave embarkation point, it was controlled by the French. But during the 7 Years' War, that was 1756 to 1763, Britain captured it. And it's right around this time that it first appears on a Liverpool map. First appears on the Eyes map of 1765. This is the Goree Island as it is today. And here you can see it on the map, on Eyes map of 1765. So this is, if you can imagine us being here today, this is where the Liver buildings, Cunard building, etc. are. This is on the old Great George's dock, 1765. It hadn't even been built, as you can see, it's in the intended dock. But you can see Goree Causeway is just mentioned here. That's where Goree is today. As you may well know, there were warehouses there that had been named after Goree. They were built in the 1790s, massive warehouse, not the biggest in Liverpool. Liverpool had an even bigger warehouse just behind this, which was owned by a slave-owning merchant called James France. Here we have a picture of them during the, just after the war. I think this just before the war. Interestingly, I think about 1802, there was a fire that burnt them down. The fire had started in France's warehouse that I mentioned earlier on, and ended up burning down the Goree warehouses. They were rebuilt shortly after, and they remained there right up until after the Second World War. They were bombed in the war, but they weren't finally demolished until after the war. Again, the Goree warehouses. These are places where many goods, goods that would be loaded on board slave ships or come off slave ships were actually stored. Now, this was the first street in Liverpool that I ever remember someone saying we should change the street name. As you can see, this is an article from the Liverpool Echo on the 5th December 1997. Councillor Ron Gould, I'm not sure if he's still a councillor today, but he was a very long-standing councillor. He found out what the Goree was named after and was so horrified that he came up with the idea of changing the street name. This caused an awful lot of hullabaloo, if anyone remembers this at the time. A lot of people got on the radio and said, oh no, we don't want to see our street names changed. So thankfully it wasn't changed. I think it's important to keep our street names. I think they tell us something about the unique history of our city and why, and for me, you know, street names are one of the ways that we keep history present at all times. You know, If you're going down streets that a street named Goree, for example, someone will ask the question, "What? Why is that? You know what? It's an awfully strange name for a street. What does it mean?" And it gives us a chance to have a discussion about these individuals and the places, etc. So for me, I would like to see street names retained with interpretive plaques that help to that provide information so that people can find out who the streets are named after and why they're named after them. Street names for me tell us something unique about how Liverpool and obviously other cities developed. So thankfully, Ron never got his way and the Goree remains today. Ironically though, he wanted to change the street from Goree to Lottery Way. And the reason why he thought that'd be a good idea is because that's where people in those days used to go to pick up their lottery winnings. Little did he know that there was actually a very well-known slave ship called the Lottery. Now, interestingly enough, just behind, on the opposite side of the road to where we are right now, we have the Goree Fountain. This is on the corner of Drury Lane and Brunswick Street. And I consider this to be Liverpool's most abstract memorial to slavery. As you can see at the bottom, it was erected in the 1960s at a time when Liverpool was even less willing to discuss its slavery history than it is today. And a lot of people have objected to this theory that it was erected in honor of the history of Liverpool's involvement in slavery. It's not known as the Goree Fountain, it's known as the Bucket Fountain, because these buckets in the middle that you can see here, I'm trying to get my cursor up, they tilt and they fill with water and they make a crashing sound. This is a plaza on three sides of this building, so you do get a wonderful echo, but with the sound of the water bouncing off the building. So it sounds like the crashing of waves. And that was intentionally done as part of this memorial fountain. But again, you'll get lots of naysayers again. This history is something that Liverpool is still struggling to come to terms with. People will tell you this has got nothing to do with slavery. So I'm going to show you some information that, although it's art, so it's always open to interpretation, for me, this is what really helps me to understand that this was erected where it was erected for the commemoration of the Goree warehouses and the role they played in slavery. So if you just note these two stairways going up to the viewing platforms, you can see the way that the steps curl round. Yeah. And as I say, the buckets are meant to symbolize water crashing. So I'm just going to show you something here. So now this is the slave fort on the island, on Goree Island. If you look through the tunnel there, you can see a white rectangle. That is actually the door of no return. That was where the enslaved people would go through to go down to the ships that would take them off to a life of slavery and premature death in the Americas. Obviously, you can see what I mentioned about the steps, the way they go around. And obviously the water at the bottom where the enslaved people went towards. So for me, that's pretty clear enough information to let me think, well, hold on, this has obviously got something to do with this island on the west coast just off the west coast of Senegal. But there's a little bit more definitive information to be provided, and here we have it. So this is on one of the viewing platforms. Now, this is an African shield. I put African in inverted commas because, it looks to me like something you'd associate with the southern part of Africa, not West Africa. But the makers at Camel Laird's in the 60s, they probably just watched Zulu. So they probably thought this was what an authentic African shield looked like, not realizing that Africa's obviously the most diverse continent on the planet with lots of different people and different cultures, etc., etc. But you can't see it on here, but it is inscribed, and the plaque talks about the Goree warehouses and that they're named after this island off the west coast of Senegal, but they don't mention in any way, shape, or form why that would have anything to do with Liverpool, blah, 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 just that they were named after them. And also that Nathaniel Hawthorne and Washington Irving both had offices at the Goree warehouses. So taking into account that, it mirrors the House of Slaves, and taking into account that there's a shield obviously done in the shape of an African plaque, it's pretty obvious what the makers we're trying to imply, although, as I say, it's a very abstract memorial because it doesn't mention slavery at all anywhere on the interpretive plaque. So we're going to move down from Brunswick Street and come over to the pier head. So the map that I showed you earlier on, this is in front, this monument is in front of the Liver building. So it's in front on the pier head facing out to the water. And it's a memorial to Sir Alfred Lewis Jones. Now, Liverpool, after the slave trade and slavery is abolished, Liverpool remains the great gateway of empire. And I would argue that it remains that way right up until the empire begins to be dismantled. Liverpool's growth mirrors the growth of the British Empire. As Britain continues to acquire colonies, so Liverpool's importance continues to grow. This too can be represented through population figures. So the highest recorded population in Liverpool's history is in the 1931 census, when the population is almost 1 million people. Then we have the Second World War, and it's really after the Second World War that Liverpool's great decline begins, with the nadir ultimately being in the late 70s, early 1980s. But that mirrors exactly what happens with the British Empire. So, Britain begins to dismantle its empire after the Second World War, and Britain then, goes back to what it had been many centuries before, a second-rate power, where it was the great empire, where the sun never set. So Britain's decline really began after the Second World War, and it was exactly the same with Liverpool. So our population in 1931 was almost 1 million people. Our population today, just in the city itself, is only about 450 to 500,000 people. So we've lost half our population in the 70 odd years since 80 years since the 1931 census. Thankfully, we've stabilized. We're no longer leaking people, so that's a positive. But again, Liverpool's decline begins as Britain dismantles its empire. Now, memorial to Sir Alfred Lewis Jones. Alfred Lewis Jones was originally from Wales, and he became the owner of the Elder Dempster shipping line. With some of his wealth, he established in 1898 the first school of tropical medicine in the country. Now, the reason why he's being mentioned in relation to Liverpool's involvement in slavery and empire is because much of his wealth came through the exploitation of the Congo. Now, many of you will have heard of King Leopold's atrocities in the Congo. It's considered to be an unacknowledged Holocaust, really. Around 10 million people were lost during the years that the Congo was dominated by Leopold. And one of the men who benefited from this domination was Alfred Lewis Jones. He had the monopoly, the shipping monopoly between Congo and Antwerp. And he employed a clerk, a man called Edward Dean Morel. This is the Tropical School of Medicine. And here we have Edward Dean Morel and Sir Alfred Lewis Jones. Dean Morel worked as a clerk. He would go over to Antwerp from time to time to, check out the ships. And he noticed that the ships that were coming in with all these fabulously wealthy products, rubber, timber, what else was on board? Palm oil. They were going back with nothing to exchange for them. All that was going back on the ships, the Elder Dempster ships going out to the Congo, was guns and soldiers. So he very rapidly realized that this was a case of forced labor. They were using coercion to get the people of the Congo to harvest these goods for them. In the case of Lord Leverhulme, who also benefited from the exploitation of the Congo, when he leased the palm oil plantations, he actually leased the people who lived on the land. So it was forced labor. He goes to Alfred Lewis Jones Morel and says, I'm not sure what's going on over here. Alfred Lewis Jones tries to calm him and say, listen, don't say anything, because if you do, I might lose my lucrative contract. So he offered him a better job, a better, higher position in the firm, etc., etc. Morel refused, he resigned, and then he went on to set up the Congo Reform Association in 1903. And it really would be the Congo Reform Association which blow the whistle on what was actually going on in the Congo. Certainly during the 20th century, a black guy, a black American called George Washington Williams, had first written about the Congo, but he died before he could really get this more well-known. Morel really did lead the campaign to kind of highlight these terrible atrocities. Roger Casement supported him with £200 to establish the institution, and one of its very esteemed members was Mark Twain. Again, it was really Morel's work that led to the uncovering of the atrocities in the Congo, and the Congo stopping being the personal fiefdom of Leopold and becoming a Belgian Congo. But even under Belgian rule, it didn't really get much better for the Congolese. So this is how, this history of trade with West Africa continues to benefit Liverpool right up to the 20th century, and it still is in many ways through forced labor, modern day slavery as such. Now, crossing over from the pier head, we come to Our Lady and St. Nicholas's Church. This was the Chapel of Ease that I mentioned to you earlier on. There's been a place of worship on this site since about the 13th century, if I remember correctly. But as I say, for its long history, it remained a Chapel of Ease. It only became a parish church just in the last year of the 17th century. Now, this is where many of Liverpool's most prominent 18th century slavers actually worshipped. Sadly, this building has been very much knocked around. In 1810, the spire fell down, the tower fell down and killed a lot of children who were attending a mass in the building. And then during the Second World War, it was bombed. So none of the building remains from the period that the slave trade was actually going on, but the graveyard still remains. And as well as many of these slave traders worshipping at this church, they were also buried in the graveyard. Some of the most notable individuals, well, one of the most notable individuals was Brian Blundell and his son Jonathan Blundell, who were both interred there. And they were both very prominent Liverpool slave traders. They established a dynasty of slave traders. Here we have this portrait. Both of these portraits actually hang in the boardroom of the Blue Coat School, and the reason being is Brian Blundell was the founder of one of Liverpool's most prestigious schools. It's now over 300 years old, and it was established by Blundell and the Reverend Robert Stide, who was rector of Liverpool in 1708. In 1713, Blundell, who'd been a ship's captain, although he never captained a slave ship, he transported slave-produced tobacco to England, and he also took refuse slaves. Refuse slaves were slaves who'd basically been worked to exhaustion in the sugar fields. Sugarcane was the most exhaustive crop for people to have to harvest. Enslaved people did not have a long life working in sugar. Tobacco was much less difficult a crop to cultivate. So Blundell and other merchants would buy worn out slaves in the Caribbean and ship them up to the Chesapeake, to the less labor intensive work on the tobacco plantations, in the hope that they could make a profit, taking these individuals who were too worn out to work in sugar to go and work in tobacco. Now, although Brian established the dynasty, his son Jonathan was far more engaged in the slave trade than his father has been. When his father retired from the sea, he then started to invest in slave trading voyages. And the Blundells would be involved in the slave trade over 3 generations. They're involved in more than 100 slaving voyages as a family. So they're responsible for sending tens of thousands of enslaved people into, as I say, into bondage and premature death in the Americas. Jonathan Blundell would use his wealth to invest in collieries. He opened up many of the collieries in and around Wigan, and he was also the single largest investor in the Liverpool Leeds Canal. Liverpool slave trading merchants were behind the development of some of the earliest canals that were built during the Industrial Age. The Sankey Canal, where 2 of the main investors were 2 Liverpool salt and slave merchants, John Blackburn and John Ashton. And as I say, Jonathan Blundell, he invested more than £2,000 in shares in the Leeds Liverpool Canal. Now, as well as slave owners being buried in the churchyard at St. Nicholas's, we also know that many enslaved people were buried there. And in fact, the earliest burial that took place in Liverpool of an easily identifiable person took place in St. Nicholas's on the 1st of October, 1717, when Abel, a blackamoor belonging to Mr. Rock, was buried in the graveyard. Mr. Rock was probably Samuel Rock, who was an early Liverpool slave trader. And then on the 23rd of February 1737, we see the first burial of a black woman in Liverpool. That took place in St. Nicholas's, as I say, in 1737. There were far less black women came to Liverpool on board slave ships as did men. And to commemorate the burial of Abel, we've just had this memorial unveiled at the beginning of the month. Again, Abel and most of the enslaved people in Liverpool would not have received markers on their graves. So we thought that Abel should have a grave. This had been mooted for about 3 years. So again, a lot of people have said, you know, this has come off the back of Black Lives Matter, blah, blah, blah. No, we wanted to get this done for his tercentenary, for the tercentenary of his burial on the 1st of October 2017. But unfortunately, we weren't able to raise the funds. But thankfully, 303 years after he was buried, we did manage to get something unveiled to him. Now, if we come out of the graveyard and go up Chapel Street, we are confronted by this fantastic building built by a very good local architect and historian, a man called James Picton. This is known as the Hargreaves Building, and it was built as the headquarters of Brown and Shipley and Co. Brown, Shipley and Co., who were a merchant bank. They didn't start out as a merchant bank, though. William Brown first came to Liverpool from Ireland via Baltimore. His family originally from Ballymena. They were linen merchants. They went over to the United States of America right around 1800. His father would then import Irish linen and then export cotton. By the beginning of the 19th century, Liverpool is becoming the epicenter of the cotton trade, again off the back of these long links of trading with the Americas. So Liverpool becomes the center of the cotton trade, and that's really that's very easy to see even to this day, because much of the world's cotton is still bought and sold using the Liverpool arbitration rules, the rules that were developed here in Liverpool during the 19th century for the buying and selling of cotton. Alexander Brown had 4 sons. He sent 3 of his sons around the cotton purchasing regions of the United States, and he sent William, his oldest son, over to Liverpool. He arrives in 1809. By 1810, he's in business, and within about 15 years, William Brown is one of the most prominent cotton purchasers anywhere in the country. By the 1830s, William Brown and Co. would be the largest purchaser of cotton. In 1838, they were responsible for purchasing almost 16% of all the cotton that came into Britain from the United States. It was the equivalent of 178,000 bales. That was more than some of the more well-known names, like the Baring brothers, for example. Again, you probably know Barings for Barings Bank. Yeah, that was founded very much through slavery and the buying and selling of slave-produced goods. Nick Leeson sent it under quite a few years ago now, but it's still pretty well remembered. William Brown's bank really grows in exactly the same way. The only difference is Brown and Shipley is still around today. The reason why it becomes known as Brown and Shipley is because William Brown takes on a partner who comes over from Delaware, so may well have known the family over in the States, comes over here, works his way up in the firm, and by about 1826, he's a full partner. And then the company would just go from strength to strength. Now, not only did they buy and sell cotton, but they actually owned plantations. So they owned plantations that employed enslaved people to grow cotton around the southern states of the US. They must have been very astute business people, because they sell the last of their plantations in 1860, literally the year before the American Civil War breaks out. And from that period on, they're just lending money to people who want to buy and sell cotton. So they become a merchant bank, and they are a merchant bank, as I said, that still exists to this day. They vacated this building in 1888 and they moved down to the City of London, where they still are today. They also have branches in Manchester and a number of other centres around the country. Again, remember I mentioned that he had three brothers. The three brothers would establish Brown Brothers Bank, which is one of the largest merchant banks in the world. It's now known as Brown Brothers and Harriman. Yes, they too have their origins in wealth accrued through slavery. So for people who are interested in the reparations movement, these are the obvious companies to kind of go and speak to, because they can be traced directly back, you know, without any separation from the organizations, from the individuals who had originally established the organizations off the back of wealth accrued through slavery. Now, very interestingly, on this building, I'll just use my cursor. Can you see? These are busts. And they're busts of important figures in the history of the Americas, again, obviously acknowledging where William Brown had made all his money. Now, they're not figures that we would celebrate today. One of them is Hernan Cortez, another one is Pizarro, Columbus is on there, and a number of other conquistadors. Now, again, you know, I suppose this would be the 20th century equivalent of sticking a bust of Goebbels and Hitler, Himmler, all these types of guys on the sides of the building, because these were individuals who were responsible for the genocide of the Native American people in order to create the great empire that Spain had in the Americas. These fellas had to go over there and do what they did, transforming the history of the world in doing so. And these are all commemorated on this building, as I say, on Chapel Street. Again, just demonstrating these long links that Liverpool has with wealth accrued in the Americas, and celebrating them, I suppose you'd say. This building was built in 1859, though, to give it its context at a time when individuals obviously didn't think that there was anything wrong in commemorating these types of figures. So Brown and Shipley became two of Liverpool's great philanthropists, and we continue to benefit from the wealth that they bestowed upon the city today. Sir William Brown, you probably know, has a street named after him called Sir William Brown Street. And the reason why is he gave £40,000 for the building of, sorry guys. He gave £40,000 for the building of the William Brown Museum and Library, probably better known today as Central Library and World Museum, but originally were named after the slave-owning merchants who paid for them to be built. The street in front was originally known as Shaw's Brow, but when the museum opened, you know, to thank him for giving this generous sum, we renamed the street and changed it from Shaw's Brow to what it's known today as William Brown Street. Now, if you go on William Brown Street, you will see a historic marker talking about him, talking about how beautiful the street is with all its civic buildings, and how he was a philanthropist and a mayor, and an MP for Liverpool. But it won't mention anything about how he gained his wealth. Now, the funny thing about this is when he gave the £40,000 for the building of the museum and library, he never gave any money for books. So we had this fantastic building with no money for books. So that's where Joseph Shipley comes in. So Joseph Shipley, he'd retired and gone back to Delaware by now. And he gave £1,000 to thank Liverpool because this is where he'd made his great fortune. So he gave £1,000 for the purchasing of books. And it was with that £1,000, £168 of which we purchased our fantastic 2-folio copy of Audubon's Birds of America. You can see it to this day. If you go to the Oak Room, you'll see it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And it actually has received the highest price for any printed work in history. Last time it was sold, I think about 2014, it went for $11.5 million. So we're quite a good investment on the £168 they paid right around 1860 in order to purchase the 2 volumes. Ironically or interestingly, Audubon was actually born in Haiti, and the family flee the country after the enslaved rose up during the rebellion. He does come to Liverpool, and he's patronized by people like the Rathbone family, who he actually stays with, and also Frederick Leyland. Did you stay with Frederick Leyland as well? That's be called. Now, as well as having this fantastic book, we also have some of his original paintings. Birds of America, obviously, it's paintings of all the birds native to the Americas. And here we have the American turkey. This was gifted to the city by the Rathbone family. As I say, he stayed with them. He was quite good friends with them. And this now hangs in the Victoria Gallery and Museum. Ironically, even that building has a connection to slavery, because Alfred Waterhouse, his father, put in a compensation claim for enslaved people who he had an interest in, but he was actually knocked back. But the family had actually, the Waterhouses, in order for Waterhouse to go off, Alfred to get his great education, his grandfather had been a very prominent Liverpool cotton merchant, buying and selling cotton, slave-produced cotton from Demerara. Now, if we cross over from the Hargreaves building, we come to Rumford Court. Rumford Court is a very interesting place because this was the headquarters of another cotton merchant and bankers, Fraser Trenholm and Company. If you look closely, you can see the flagpoles. You'll see a Union Jack there and a Stars and Stripes. When I first started doing these tours more than 20 years ago, that was not a Stars and Stripes. That was actually a rebel flag. The Confederate flag used to fly from this building, acknowledging the links between Rumford Court and the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Again, you can probably imagine in Liverpool, where everyone's becoming very wealthy off the back of slave-produced cotton, many of the merchants were actually supportive of the Confederacy during the war. Liverpool merchants did not want to see the end of slavery in the Deep South, because obviously, you know, we all know that the highest cost associated with the production of any commodity is labor. So while we're not having to pay the labor, it keeps the price of cotton low. If we have to start paying people where we used to get them to work for nothing, then the price is going to go up. So many of the Liverpool merchants supported the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And from this building is where a number of ships were commissioned for the Confederate States Navy. A man called James Dunwoody Bullock had an office here. James Dunwoody Bullock was appointed envoy to England by Jefferson Davis himself, Jefferson Davis being the only president of the Confederacy in its short history. He came to Liverpool, and basically the Fraser Trenholm and Company became the bankers for the Confederacy in Britain. So they were the ones who were bankrolling the building of the ships from this building here. The most famous of those ships was known as the CSS Alabama. This is James Dunwoody Bullock. I'll tell you more about him in a second. The ship is the Alabama, as I mentioned earlier on, and this will go on to become the most successful of all the commerce raiders that served in the Confederate States Navy. This ship was so successful that at the end of the war, because Britain was not supposed to get involved in supporting either side during the war, it was supposed to be neutral, Britain had to pay back the United States $15 million, the equivalent of £3 million in compensation for the ships that had been destroyed by these naval ships that had been built here in Liverpool. As well as supporting the Confederacy and building ships, we also built guns for the Confederacy. In fact, it said that the first gun that was fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, this is the event that opens the American Civil War. It said to the first gun that fired this, that was fired, the first cannon that was fired, is said to have been made here at the Preston Forsyth Foundry over on Lydia Ann Street, which is just at the back of Duke Street. Liverpool merchants weren't soft though. They were selling guns to both sides during the war. They just made the Union pay about twice as much for every gun that they did for the Confederacy. So that was their way of kind of making a profit but still giving the Confederacy a little bit of a help over their northern neighbours. As well as the Liverpool having a role in the first act of the American Civil War, we also had a role in the last act of the Civil War, and that was the surrendering of the CSS Shenandoah, a whole 6 months after General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. So he surrendered in the April, if I remember correctly, of 1865. The Shenandoah surrendered to the captain of the HMS Donegal in the Mersey in the November of 1865, and the last time the Confederate flag was lowered was at the was when the CSS Shenandoah was surrendered. And then James Waddell, who was the captain of the ship, he went and had tea with the mayor at the town hall. So again, just another example of how these Confederate figures were very much supported in Liverpool during the period. Lots. This is just I haven't even like scratched the surface about Liverpool's involvement in the Civil War. Liverpool has so many memorials and monuments to individuals who are involved in the Confederacy in some way. Coming back to James Dunwoody Bullock, after the war ended, if you'd fought in the Navy or if you'd fought in the Army, you were given a general pardon. If you'd come overseas in order to get other people to get involved in the war, you were considered to be a traitor. And if James Dunwoody Bullock had gone back after the war, he could well have been executed. So he stayed here in Liverpool and he died here along with his brother, Irvin Stevens Bullock. As you probably can guess, what did they get into after the war ended? Yes, they became cotton brokers. When they died, they were actually interred in Toxteth Park Cemetery. So we have two graves to Confederates here in Liverpool. From time to time, the Daughters of the Confederacy come over and hold ceremonies at these graves. I've been to two over the years. For the centenary of his death in 2001, and then when his brother's grave was paid, courtesy of the Liverpool City Council, they paid for the re-erection of his brother's grave, which had been damaged and the cross was broken, so they paid to have it re-erected. I'm of the opinion that if the council can pay to have monuments to people who supported slavery erected, then they should be willing to contribute towards a memorial to people who were enslaved here in Liverpool. But we'll see what happens. James Dunwoody Bullock was also a maternal uncle of Teddy Roosevelt, who came to Liverpool to visit his uncle James and wrote about it in his memoirs. Very interesting figure who, as I say, remained in Liverpool and actually died here. In 1968, when the United Daughters of the Confederacy came to Liverpool, they re-erected his grave and they put a new monument on there. And the monument says, American by birth, Englishman by choice. But he certainly wasn't an Englishman by choice. If he'd gone back to America, where he had his beautiful house, Roswell Hall, he may well have been strung up. So it certainly wasn't out of choice. He had to stay here, otherwise he could have been executed. Now, if we walk up out of Rumford Court and cross over into Exchange Flags, we are confronted by the Nelson Memorial. I think this is probably, well, for me, it's probably my most favorite public monument in the city. It memorializes Nelson, but these figures are very interesting. You can see around the bottom there's 4 chained figures. And this has led to lots of controversy over the years. Liverpool has some great public art, and for me, good public art, any art is, has people talking long after, the art has been originally erected, and people are still talking about this more than 200 years since it was unveiled in 1813. One of the people who actually saw this memorial and again had an opinion on it was Herman Melville. So I'm sure you've heard of Herman Melville. He was the man who wrote Moby Dick, but he also wrote another book called Redburn, which is semi-autobiographical. He's kind of following in the footsteps of his father. So he comes to Liverpool and he comes to Exchange Flags and he sees this monument. And he acknowledges that these figures are nothing to do with slavery. But he says that he never could look at their swarthy limbs and manacles without being involuntarily reminded of 4 African slaves in the marketplace. Now, I can tell you for a fact that when this was erected, the merchants were not of the opinion that this had anything to do with slavery. Although Professor Alison Yarrington has suggested that William Roscoe, who's one of Liverpool's few abolitionists, may well have been interested in acknowledging the role that Liverpool had played in slavery, you know, as a slight to the merchant. There's nothing explicit in it, although other people have come along and said this has probably got this. This may well have a connection to slavery, which has caused all the problems. What I can say to you, on paper, there's nothing associating it with slavery, but indirectly, there certainly is a link to slavery. First of all, Nelson was a strong supporter of slavery, although some information has just come out to try and say he wasn't. I'm not having it. It's very, very weak evidence. But probably more importantly is who paid for the monument. This was paid for by Liverpool organisations deeply linked to slavery and merchants who were slave merchants in their own right. So the largest single contribution for the building of the Nelson Memorial came from the Liverpool Corporation. They gave £1,000. Second largest was the Liverpool's Underwriters Association, the first insurance underwriters association anywhere in the country, founded in 1802. They gave £750. And the third largest organisational donation came from the West India Association. Again, the clue is in the name. It was mainly made up of merchants who owned plantations or who were trading in goods that were used on the plantations or produced on the plantations. So people who were buying and selling sugar or buying the equipment, sugar boiling pans, etc., that were used to buy enslaved people in order to cultivate the crop. The single largest donation from an individual came from a man called William Aspinall, who came from the Aspinall slave trading dynasty. He gave £200, massive sum at the time, towards the building of this monument. That dwarfed William Roscoe's, who gave £52. But he, being someone who's very interested in the arts, he contributed to its design, and that's where Professor Yarrington has come up with the idea that he may well have been trying to slight the merchant community by having these chained figures on it. So as regards Nelson, this is what he said, writing in a letter to Simon Taylor, the visit was a plantation in Jamaica, just on the eve, a couple of months before Trafalgar. I was bred, as you know, in the good old school, and taught to appreciate the value of our West India possessions, and neither in the field or in the Senate shall their interests be infringed whilst I have an arm to fight in their defence or a tongue to launch my voice against the damnable and cursed doctrine of Wilberforce and his hypocritical allies. I won't go into detail about this new information that's come out, but this letter has supposedly been forged, and the only real difference is the word curse turns to cruel. And off the back of this single change in words, the Royal Navy Museum has kind of come up with the idea that what he means was it was cruel that he wanted to see the end of the slave trade, because this would lead to the wiping out of all the enslaved people by their evil owners. How we come to that conclusion, I don't know, because the slave trade did not see the end of slavery. When the slave trade was abolished, slavery continued then for another 27 years. So obviously that was not the case. But yeah, somehow it's been in the Daily Mail and all the newspapers last week. Somehow they come to the conclusion that that means that Nelson wasn't a supporter of slavery. Go figure. So we come to the front of the town hall. I think I'm going to have to rush because we won't have any time for questions. Here we have Liverpool Town Hall. I consider this to be the greatest architectural monument to Liverpool's involvement in slavery. The reason why I say that is because the wealth that went into the building of this building came directly by many of Liverpool's most prominent slave trading families. Foxbourne, in his English Merchants, he goes on to say that the families who were involved with the Blundells, the Earls and the Cunlish, the big slave trading dynasties, as I've been mentioning throughout today's lecture, Now, as well as it being an architectural memorial because of the wealth, where the wealth came from to build it, it's also recorded on the building itself. So if we go to the eastern side of the town hall, where it joins with High Street, and look up at the frieze, you will see this face. Now, the frieze on this side of the building basically commemorates the places that were making Liverpool so fabulously wealthy during this period. You can see elephant's teeth, the ivory. You'll see an elephant as well on this frieze, and further down you'll see a Native American woman, alligators, etc. So the two great continents that were making Liverpool so fabulously wealthy in the 1740s, when this was first begun to be built, and at a time when Liverpool has just become the epicenter of the slave trade, finally done Bristol out of the trade. So Liverpool is celebrating the places that are making it so fabulously wealthy, and obviously, as well as having elephants' teeth on board these ships, slave ships, they obviously bought and sold enslaved Africans as well. So sadly, in the case of Africa, this woman was one of the commodities that was actually on board the slave ships. The builder of the town hall was a man called Joseph Brooks. The architect was John Wood of Bath, or Bath, depending on where you're from. But the actual builder, the person who owned the firm that built it, was Joseph Brooks. And Brooks Alley is named after his family. Brooks family are very well remembered in the diagram that you can see here. The diagram of this ship, the ship was known as the Brooks. This is the diagram that shows the layout of a slave ship with all the people laid out almost like sardines in a can. It was said of slaves on a man in his coffin had more space on than a slave on a slave ship, and this really provides graphic evidence of that. Joseph Brooks, as well as being a slave trader, he was also treasurer of the parish, and one of his jobs was responsibility for the well-being of the poor. Now, in High Street, in the very street that I said, where you can see the bust of the African woman, a man called Richard Robinson had his offices, and on the 27th of November 1767, he offered for sale one Negro man and two boys. There were a number of slave sales here in Liverpool. Again, I've already provided evidence of the fact that enslaved people were buried here, but slaves were actually sold on the streets of Liverpool again. Many local historians have argued the toss about this, but this is primary evidence. You can go and see these in the newspapers throughout the period. The largest slave sale that takes place in Britain that is recorded, that we've currently found recorded in the newspaper archive, actually takes place in Liverpool a year before this one, when on the 12th of September 1766, 11 Negroes were sold at the Exchange Coffee House in Water Street. The Angola was the ship that they were brought in on, and again, the Drinkwaters would go on to become a very prominent family, both here and in the Isle of Man, where they owned large estates. Just around the corner from the town hall, back in Brunswick Street, we have Haywood's Bank. This is the oldest purpose-built bank building left in Liverpool. Liverpool, off the back of the slave trade, becomes a financial hotspot. Indeed, of the 14 important Liverpool banks listed after 1750, 10 of them were founded by Liverpool slave trading merchants. It wasn't just banking as well. Liverpool became a hotbed for maritime insurance. And again, this would lead to the great tradition of insurance firms being founded in Liverpool in 1919, when the Royal Insurance Company and the Liverpool London Globe Assurance Company, when they merged, it was the largest merger in insurance history. Two provincial insurance companies founded here in Liverpool. Again, both of those institutions had origins and wealth accrued through slavery. The Royal Institution, the largest single investor, was Josias Booker, again, who'd made his money, him and his family had made their money in Guyana, managing estates and then owning estates in their own right. And the Liverpool London Globe Assurance Company had been founded as the Liverpool Fire Insurance Company in 1836. And again, many of the merchants who founded that company were merchants who'd received large amounts of compensation when slavery had been abolished by the British in 1834. The Haywoods were a slave trading family who used their money and to then diversify into banking. They founded the bank in 1773 and then moved to this larger accommodation in 1800. As I say, it's the oldest purpose-built bank building still standing in Liverpool. Here's the family, two of them. Again, these will become very, very prominent merchants here in Liverpool. They also built large houses out in the suburbs, Lark Hill. So if you know the West Derby area, this was the home of one of the homes of the Haywoods. They also would later go on to build Norris Green, which was another house out in the Norris Green area. Sadly, only part of the stables survive today of Norris Green, and Lark Hill is totally gone, sadly. Again, not only were slaves bought and sold in Liverpool, but this advertisement shows that enslaved people did not accept their enslavement passively. So on the 4th of May 1718, the Liverpool Advertiser, the following advertisement was published. And as you can see, it says, "Runaway on the 18th of April last from Prescott, a black man slave named George Jermaine Foley. Although he'd run away in Prescott, his owner, Captain Thomas Ralph, he actually lived in Williamson Street, just off Williamson Square. So he was based here in Liverpool. This advertisement was put in the newspaper. And it says that you can, if you go and inform someone at the Talbot Inn, basically if you take the enslaved person to the Talbot Inn, you can receive a reward. Talbot Inn sadly did not survive into the photographic age, but we have a picture of it here. And this became coffee houses and taverns became the center of business. And if you think of Lloyd's of London, that was originally a coffee house, and then it became the headquarters of one of the largest insurance companies in the world. The Talbot Hotel became the headquarters of the Bank of Liverpool, which was founded here in 1831. Many of the most important slave-owning families were also some of the most important investors in the Bank of Liverpool. The first chairman was William Brown. The Horsfall family were also involved, who built so many beautiful churches in and around Liverpool. The Sandbach family and a number of other very prominent Liverpool slave trading families were all behind the foundation of the Bank of Liverpool. The Bank of Liverpool would go on to become the only national bank in the country to have its headquarters outside the City of London, when the Bank of Liverpool acquired Martin's Bank at the beginning of the 20th century. And when we acquired this bank a few years later, the Bank of Liverpool, it was now known as Martin's Bank, because Martin's Bank had its history going right back to the Elizabethan period. When the Bank of Liverpool acquired Martin's Bank, whereas usually the company acquiring the other company will change all the names from their old name to their name, Liverpool did it slightly differently. We became known as Martin's Bank and the Bank of Liverpool Limited, shortened to Martin's Bank. And this is this building that we see here, one of the finest Art Deco buildings anywhere in the country, Grade 2 star listed building, built in it was completed in the 1930s. Some of you, although it's been closed as a bank for many years, some of you will have seen the interior of this building in quite a notable film that have forgotten, Harry Potter. This building doubled as Gringotts Banking Hall in one of the recent Eddie Redmayne films, which I'm not a big fan of. But that's the interior, Grade 2 star listed building. Now, interestingly, if you come out of the main entrance and go to the officer's entrance, you'll see these very interesting reliefs in the doorway. So I'm just going to circle it here. There's me. This is what we all would have been doing if it wasn't for COVID. I would have been taking you to see these things. But if you look at these reliefs, so you can see the dolphins and then a man. This man, if you look at his hands, though, he's actually Neptune. He's got webbed fingers. Again, I'll explain to you more from when you look at this picture. So it's a bit brighter. So up above, you have to take my word for this. Up above the dolphins, you'll see a grasshopper. The grasshopper was the emblem of Martin's Bank. Martin's Bank had been found in the Elizabethan period in an inn called the Grasshopper Inn down in London. So when the Bank of Liverpool acquired Martin's, we incorporated their insignia into the Bank of Liverpool's insignia. The dolphins and Neptune, obviously emblematic of the sea being so responsible for Liverpool's great wealth. But look at his webbed hands. Now, look at his eyes as well. He's looking down. He looks rather solemn, in my opinion, anyway. Again, art's always open to interpretation. But his heads are resting on these two little African boys who've got a better, more well-kept afro than I've got, that's for sure. And their heads are bowed. Now, you can't see here, so you'll have to take my word for it, but just around the neck, in fact, you might actually be able to see, there's actually like a collar around both of their necks, and on their wrists, you will also see like bangles on their wrists and also on their ankles. Now, again, this building was only built in the 1930s by Herbert J. Rouse, who was the architect, and then he got Herbert Tyson Smith to carve the reliefs. Now, I again, this is totally open to interpretation, but I think how ironic when you know the history of this building that this building would have these reliefs in the doorways, if it wasn't some type of homage to how the bank had been established or where the wealth had come from, even down to the little African boys holding bags of money, whether that signifies, again, the wealth of Africa, and they've got bowed heads in themselves. To me, it looks like Neptune is comforting these boys. And again, whether Rouse knew about the history of the bank, I don't know, but I find it quite ironic that you'd have them have reliefs like this in the doorway of a bank founded by merchants involved in slavery. Hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. Sorry, I've gone over slightly, not too much that.
Thank you for that. I don't think we need to worry too much about going over time. I think there is like lots to cover here as well. And while we wait for some questions to come through, first thing I wanted to start with was one of the early things that you said, in that Liverpool at that time was like the world in one city. So everyone was here and everyone was reflected. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the street names and the building names specifically, in the sense of having such a visible history that relates to everyone, but that not everyone is comfortable living with. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, for me, I mean, again, I consider Liverpool to be the greatest memorial to slavery. So if we start wiping those things away, within one generation, people forget. For me, history in the public realm is people's history. It's people having to bump into history whether they like it or not. Some people say, well, okay, take the statues down and put them in museums. Not everyone goes to museums. There's a whole demographic of people that have got no interest in the museum, certainly not in the history of slavery. People will go out of their ways to avoid that history. For me, I think that by keeping these names in the public realm and these monuments and memorials, we force people to engage with the history of the city, whether they like it or not. Many of these monuments and memorials, the buildings are used as landmarks that people use in order to traverse their way around the city. Street names, absolutely. One of the things I didn't mention is that the Goree, the fountain that I showed you, the building on all three sides, it's now known as Beetham Plaza, but it hasn't always been called Beetham Plaza. It only became Beetham Plaza 20 years ago. The building was built in the 60s, and for its long history, it was known as Wilberforce House. Now, I take people there all the time, and I get people coming on my tours from 8 to 80, people who've lived in Liverpool their entire lives. I ask them, many of them, do you remember what this building used to be called? And almost everyone says no. And then I say, well, it's only changed its name 20 years ago. And so I'll say, it used to be called Wilberforce House. And they're like, oh yeah, of course. It used to be a tax office or something. Some type of government business used to go on in there. And that just demonstrates for me how quickly people forget when you start erasing these names from the public realm. Whatever you think about the deification of Wilberforce, this idea that that's a name associated with slavery, with this memorial, with this fountain right behind it, and yet literally in the same generation, people have forgotten within one generation what this building was originally named. So how can you expect people who were born after that was renamed to ever think of it being anything else? For me, that's how we keep history current. It's not by writing it in books. It's not by putting it in museums. It's about having it in the public realm. And I know it's painful, but for me, the way I interpret these figures now is it's almost as a rogues gallery. We don't nowadays. I mean, you know, we don't really put statues up anymore. When we do memorials and monuments, they tend to be abstract, you know. So they were very much of their time. Putting a statue up that was supposed to be a likeness of an individual was quite a Victorian or an Edwardian thing to do. Now, you know, when I look at those things, I don't think, oh, wow, what a wonderful individual because you're up on a pedestal. I think to myself, that's someone who I need to find out more about. And that's the reason why I know so much about these people who are memorialized in Liverpool. I went to them not knowing who they were, saw the names, and then went, oh, I'll go and find out about him. So when people say these aren't educational tools, I absolutely object to that. I think they are occupational tools, educational tools, and they can direct you to research that you wouldn't have necessarily have thought about if the statue hadn't been there.
It's so interesting to hear like how you started doing these tours and kind of what prompted you as well. And I didn't realize that you've been doing the tours for so long. And I'm really curious to see like what has changed over that time. Like not only like how much you know, but also how much people know on the tours or what brings them to you, or even just kind of what the general perception is. Like how has that changed over the time?
I would suggest that it's only just changing now. Now people want to know more because they realize how these contested histories are important to how people see themselves within society today. So when the terrible murder of George Floyd happened, people started to make these links to events that had taken place hundreds of years beforehand. This is quite a new phenomenon. Whether that's come off the back of social media, making this information more easy to digest, these are the links that I'd always made years ago, and people are like, oh, don't be silly, blah, blah, blah. But I, you know, because of the type of upbringing that I had with the mother that I've got and the grandmother that I had, they made that very easy for me to make that connection. Hold on, you cannot look at the way you're living today in a vacuum. Everything that you do today is because of an event that took place yesterday. So that they very much pushed me to kind of look at the public realm as a theatre for telling these stories. And because my family have been here for so long, I very much feel like my family have contributed to the development of this city. My family weren't economic migrants to this city. They've been here for over 200 years. And I think in many ways that kind of gives me not a unique outlook, but it makes me look at this city and how it's developed over the longue durée, rather than just, you know, over my lifetime or the lifetime of my parents, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And that leads really nicely onto my next question, which was, what do you say to people who say like slavery has been over for such a long time and that we need to move on? Like, what do you say to people who think that slavery somehow isn't relevant to them or it doesn't affect them directly? Like, how do you build your argument for that?
Okay, well, I can do it. I do it in a number of different ways. I do it through the tours primarily because I say this is the legacy of slavery in the built environment. Then, you know, I talked about the banks. Many of these institutions still exist. The names may have changed, but the wealth that created them in the first place, so that they could have a 200-year history, came directly out of slavery. You know, I tell people that the Bank of England, one commentator said that it shouldn't have been called the Bank of England, it should have been called the Bank of the West Indies, because so many of the early governors had made their wealth in the Caribbean, in slave plantations. There's so many ways you can kind of say to people, hold on. And then on top of that, the legacies of slavery did not die with slavery. You know, all the disparities in health and well-being, etc., that people of African descent, people of the African diaspora struggle with, is directly out of is a legacy of slavery. The reason why George Floyd was slaughtered the way that he was slaughtered was because Black people's lives are not seen as being as valued as white people's lives in America. That didn't happen yesterday. That's come out of this long history of slavery, Jim Crow, you know, not being able to vote, etc. So for me, you know, I go to a Southern author, I'll go to Faulkner, and he says, you know, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. You know, people of African descent are still struggling with the legacies of slavery today.
I've got a question from an audience member, and this is Bernard on Twitter, and they're interested to know if your tours usually cover the Tarletons. And
Yes,
maybe you can explain what the Tarletons are, because I don't know what that is.
yeah. Well, actually, we've just walked past where one of the main members of the Tarleton family was actually born. So the Tarletons were another of these slave trading dynasties. Um, They were involved in the slave trade over 3-4 generations. They had slave traders, they had parliamentary MPs who fought to ensure that slavery wasn't abolished, and they were some of the most important figures in the city's history. We have a street named after them here in Liverpool. They have a great legacy in terms of art because they they had their paintings painted by the finest artists in Britain, men like Reynolds and Joseph Wright of Derby. Banasta Tarleton, we have 2 streets in Liverpool named after him. Well, named one Tarleton Street and Banasta Street. He was an MP. Wilberforce refers to him as his old enemy because he was the most vociferous of the Liverpool anti-abolitionist MPs. His painting, his portrait actually hangs in the National Gallery down in London. Overly larger than life-size, typical Scouser, larger than life-size painting in the National Gallery in London. So these were a very important slave trading family, again responsible for about over 100 slaving voyages over about 3 generations.
And philanthropy is something that comes up a lot in the tour as well, and it's something that we've talked about previously too. But maybe you could cover that again for anyone who's new.
Yeah, I mean, this is again another one of the legacies. Why, when people say, you know, it's time to forget about it, well, you know, most of Liverpool's higher educational institutions are a direct legacy of wealth accrued through slavery. Most of Liverpool's best secondary schools are a direct legacy of wealth accrued through slavery. The Blue Coat School and Liverpool Collegiate are both schools that were established by merchants who'd made money through slavery. Many of our most important cultural institutions, you know, the great legacy of art that we have here, the Walker Art Gallery is considered to be the National Gallery of the North. You know, some of the paintings that we've got in there are directly connected to slavery, or they were saved for the city by wealth that was accrued through slavery in terms of the Roscoe collection. So there's just it's a myriad of ways. What I would say is when you scratch the surface of Liverpool, slavery comes oozing out, and it's layer upon layer upon layer. You know, so I mentioned the University of Liverpool in my lecture. I mentioned who designed the building that became the original building. 2 of the founders, so we have the Royal Institution, which is this forerunner institution, but then the forwards are behind Liverpool getting university college status, which is the beginning of the university as a proper university. They'd made their money through buying and selling slave-produced cotton and gun running to the Confederacy during the American Civil War. They also were apologists for slavery. They, you know, William Bowerforward, he writes about how well the Negroes were treated in America, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, we'd be here all day. You know, this is, you know, the green spaces in Liverpool, you know, charitable institutions in Liverpool, they all have connections to slavery.
There's a huge amount of like cognitive dissonance, especially when we're talking about philanthropy. The idea of like on one hand being a slaver and on the other hand donating and kind of acting in a really charitable way, which is really confusing to look at from a contemporary point of view. But I guess in that kind of perspective, it would have just been the thing to do.
Yeah, but it's funny that you mentioned that in the contemporary, because I'm really interested in how these contemporary responses, with this cognitive dissonance, is not just, it's with us today. So Liverpool, I spend a lot of time talking to people who love Liverpool's history. But when you bring up slavery, it's like you've insulted the mothers. You know, it's like history is important, but why are you bringing that up? You know, when you bring up history, literally people who've got a love of history will say, oh, forget about it. It was in the past. You know, these are the bizarre responses that you get from people who say they've got an interest in history. And Liverpool people are very proud of their history, as long as you don't mention slavery. And then if you do, then they don't want to hear about it. You know, it's very interesting.
We don't really get to pick and mix like that, do we?
Of course, that's
I have another question, which is slightly going off track a little bit, but I'm really curious about the gender roles in this. So both for like the enslaved people, but also for the slavers as well. So we're looking at a lot of slides that you've put together, very much of men. And I'm wondering, like, what is the role of women in this, like on all sides of this?
They are there. Obviously, there was enslaved women here. There were a few merchants or people who benefited from male members and their involvement in slavery. Probably the most important single merchant figure, female merchant figure in Liverpool during the 18th century was a woman called Sarah Clayton. So if you know Clayton Square, she was the woman who laid out Clayton Square. All the streets that go off the square are named after families who married into the Claytons. The Claytons were a very prominent Liverpool slave trading family. Again, William didn't have any sons, so she got most of the dough, and she became an entrepreneur. She invested in lots of different avenues of wealth accumulation, but sadly, she became bankrupt. So women are there, but their stories are not as well known. And it's difficult to find information about them because everything is done through the prism of the man, you know. So there is some stories, but they're more difficult to tease out. Yeah.
Okay. So it's there's something about history and only knowing certain perspectives or certain narratives of that. And there's something kind of frustrating, but something really exciting about that, knowing that there is like this untapped source of information if you could just get to it somehow.
It's so infuriating for me, and especially, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at Black people as well. So for me, you know, my PhD is on the Black presence in Liverpool. You know, so it's Black people are invisible. They're there, but they're invisible because you can't find out anything about their lives. Really, you can find parish records about them. You sometimes find them in wills. You know, and then you find little vignettes of information that you're like, oh, I want to know more. So, for example, many of the African slave traders who were trading with the Europeans, they would send their children to Liverpool in order to get an education. Many of them sent their daughters as well as their sons, and evidence given in Parliament mentions how the daughters don't go back. The sons go back because they're kind of to get a head up in the trade. So you learn good English, you learn, you know, what's the price of fish, basically, so you don't get ripped off. You know, I know how much he's getting the beads for, I know how much he's getting the guns for, so don't come here asking for more, you know, more than they're worth. But I can't find out what's happened to the women. And it's so infuriating, you know. We know that there were Black women who did quite well. What happened to them, though, over time, it's very, very difficult. And it's got me tearing my hair out. Women are in parish records, it's about an 80-20 split. So there's far more men coming here, or certainly being recorded in the parish records, than there are women. Obviously, many of those men would be working in trades, so you would expect there to be a lot more men. Men were obviously worth more, and when they were enslaved, because they could work, you know, they could carry heavier loads. So these are some of the history isn't equal. You know, it's one of those types of things that you just got to try and do your best with what you've got. And primary sources, it's a shame. But I really want to find out what happened to this, like I say, these women who came here and didn't go back to West Africa. And these were elite women. These were the children of West African merchants. What happened to them?
Well, that's going to have to be like your follow-up book or something, because I think there's lots of us who are very, very interested to know more about that.
Definitely.
I've got another question here, and this is from Querying Scouser. And they say, this is a fascinating talk and it's shocking at the same time. I went to school in the early 1970s, but I wasn't taught about Liverpool's involvement in slavery or Liverpool's involvement in the American Civil War. Are kids now taught this in our schools today? Because they should be.
Well, we get Key Stage 3 on slavery, but I think in Liverpool, again, this is going to sound really parochial, we have a really great opportunity to use the local to tell the global, because Liverpool has looked out to the world for the period when it was most important. It gives us this opportunity to tell these much deeper and much more meaningful stories. So obviously the curriculum is not based on there's not a local aspect in terms of the slave trade, but in Liverpool, there's so many ways that you could give it that Liverpool flavor, either through doing tours or taking people to museums, art galleries, etc. I think this is a really interesting way that we can bring this history to our young people in ways that aren't just textbook, because I think textbook, you know, I can, doing these tours, when we get to do them, I can engage with a much better or a much more particular demographic, people that I could never reach in a classroom are fascinated and transfixed when you take them out onto a tour. That's another reason why I'm against changing street names and taking down monuments, because when you take people to these places, I get a much different like reaction than when I just tell people about it in a space like this. So yeah, I think what we can do is find ways, if you've got the teachers, you know, find ways to get this kind of stuff onto the curriculum, because these were important events in world history. I mentioned how much Britain had to pay America after the Civil War because of the role the Liverpool merchants had played. So yeah, it's fascinating, but I'd like to see us find other ways of kind of engaging with our young people.
I've got a few more questions. So this is a question from Dan Moggs. Can you confirm which was the first country to abolish transatlantic slavery? Some say it was Britain, but I'm not so sure.
No, it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't Britain. When you're talking about transatlantic slavery as opposed to the slave trade, Britain, sorry, wasn't even the first nation to abolish the slave trade. Denmark abolished the slave trade before Britain. Haiti abolished slavery long before Britain abolished slavery in the 1830s. So again, this is just another one of those myths where people say, you know, the British want to claim we were the first, we did away with the first. No, they never in either context, whether you're talking about the slave trade or slavery.
Okay, and here's a question from Vince. Hi, Laurence. I was brought up in Toxteth and lived in Upper Hill Street. Can you say something about St. James and St. Matthew's Church on the corner of Upper Parliament Street? It was closed for 35 years and during the past 10 years has reopened.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of Liverpool's most important 18th and 19th century churches were founded by merchants who were involved in slavery and the slave trade. St. James's is the oldest Georgian church that's still more or less intact in the city centre. It was opened in 1775. And yeah, from the very beginning, it was a place where many slave traders actually worshipped. Slaves were baptized in that church. Very few black people were actually buried in that graveyard, though. Again, by this time, there was a poor people's graveyard, which is where you tend to find most of the enslaved people being buried. One of the merchants who went there, though, was a man called Moses Benson, and he was the man who paid for the building of St. James's School. Very rich Liverpool slave trader. He'd made his money in Jamaica as a factor. The factors were like the middlemen. They were the ones who put the owners of the slave ships in touch with the owners of the plantations. He made a large amount of money, comes back to Liverpool, and then starts engaging in the slave trade directly himself, owning ships. Now, what he managed to do while he was in Jamaica was get himself a black family. And one of those children that he had, a man called Ralph Benson, is the earliest MP of colour, certainly of partial African descent, to ever serve in the British Parliament. So when last year, before the election, Jeremy Corbyn tweeted out that Labour elected the first black MPs to Parliament in 1987. So I had to tweet him back, say, hold on, Jeremy, you're only out by about 175 years at least, because of this guy who's the son of this slave trader who's buried at St. James's Church. Both him and his son, who served as an MP, are buried in St. James's. So it's a very prominent place. It was also the church that many black people were baptized in at the beginning of the 19th century, late 18th into the 19th century. These were people who lived in the area that became known as Little Africa. So the Baltic, long before it was the Baltic area, it was known as Little Africa, because some of the original descendants, the original inhabitants of that particular part of Liverpool were people of African descent. As part of my PhD, I've kind of gone through and done a map of where all these where the addresses where these people were living, and many of them were living in the what we now call the Baltic area: Kitchen Street, Bridgewater Street, New Bird Street. These are all the places where black people were living. In 1906, correspondent from the Liverpool Courier, he writes about this area and he goes, this area was once known as Little Africa, and still the oldest inhabitants of the area of the Negro race. And you can see them standing with their children and grandchildren surrounding them. So this part of Liverpool, this is why I say to, like when I said earlier on about the world in one city, and you know, what does the quintessential Scouser look like? There's been black people in this city since it had a population of less than 10,000 people. So, Black people have been an ever present since Liverpool has been an important place.
We talked about this a little bit last time as well, but like, again, that role of religion, and again, going back to like cognitive dissonance and the idea of going to church and worshiping and being closer to God while enslaving people, again, are two things that are very difficult to hold in my head at the same time.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and about the baptisms as well. So whether they were forced baptisms or if they were kind of voluntary.
Yeah.
And then also maybe following up with like the work that you've been doing around the memorial.
Yeah. So what we have is a situation where people were baptized because there was a theory amongst enslaved people that if you were baptized, you automatically became free. Then there was people who were baptized with the permission of their owners. So you'll find it, for example, in St. James's, you'll find a man called Thomas Aspinall, who was a member of the Aspinall family I mentioned earlier on. He'd actually been based in Jamaica. He retires back to Liverpool and he brings a slave with him and has him baptized in the church, but it's with the appropriation of his master, Thomas Aspinall. Obviously, Thomas Aspinall, his master, sorry, the slave had been baptized with his permission.
This is all just a very kind of fascinating look into the history of Liverpool. And then also, maybe you could talk a little bit about the memorial work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so we've been raising money to have a memorial erected to the enslaved people who lived, died, and were buried in Liverpool, because Liverpool has kind of forgotten about these people. As I mentioned in the lecture, many people will tell you no slaves came to Liverpool. So we think it's about time that we had a memorial to the enslaved people in Liverpool who've been forgotten. In Liverpool, we have memorials to lots of terrible events that have taken place. And we think that Liverpool should really memorialize its role in a forgotten Holocaust, the role it played in the enslavement of literally millions and millions of people. So we've raised £35,000, which came off the back of seeing Colston come down. So I'm very much of the opinion that I want to build things up, for me, it's about having things standing side by side with these memorials to people who did terrible things, so we can have this much more complete story of how cities developed, and certainly within the public realm. The public realm for me is the best classroom. So the way I want to address that is by having a memorial that commemorates the enslaved people who were buried here in Liverpool. Now, alongside that, we want to have some legacy projects. So we're having a tour guiding scholarship. At the moment, I'm the only person who does these things. If I get ran over by a bus tomorrow, that's it. We can't have that. Need to get more young people involved. And we also want to hold an essay competition for schools to allow young people, this would be an annual occurrence, to allow young people to be able to get involved to allow young people to be able to research an aspect of Liverpool's history, Liverpool's Black history. And we also want to maybe do a photography competition as well. Just ways of kind of getting our young people to understand and find out more things about the history of slavery in Liverpool.
I think that's a very beautiful and fitting place to end things. So thank you again for your time this evening, but also over the course of the whole month. And I've definitely learned a lot about this new city that I'm living in. So thank you for that. And once we're able to gather in person again, then I'm sure we'll have lots of people coming on these walking tours of the city. So thank you for your time, and thank you for all of this knowledge.
Thank you very much. We've got a Just Giving page now as well, guys. If you want to make any donations to the Liverpool enslaved, just put that in, you should find it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mariama. Take care. Bye.
Bye.